Good afternoon, members of the audience and special guests. Before we begin the proceedings, and on behalf of all those present, I would like to acknowledge that this webinar is hosted on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I would also like to pay respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. This session will now be recorded. We will record audio, screen share, and our presenters. We will not be recording any video or audio input from the audience. Welcome to all students, staff, and all friends of the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney. My name is Amy Ma, and I am the Events and Communications Officer at UTS ACRI. UTS ACRI is an independent, non-partisan research institute established in 2014 by the University of Technology, Sydney. UTS ACRI is Australia's first and only research institute devoted to studying the Australia-China bilateral relationship. UTS seeks to inform Australia's engagement with China through research, analysis, and dialogue, grounded in scholarly rigour. More details are available on uts.edu.au/ACRI. Today, UTS ACRI hosts a webinar featuring Mr. Dan Ryan, Executive Director of the National Conservative Institute of Australia. He will detail the origins, influence, and future impact of national conservatism and what this means for Australia's relationship with China. UTS ACRI Director Professor James Lawrenson will be moderating this discussion. Audience questions are welcome at the end, so please remember to submit your questions using the Q&A tab along the bottom panel of this webinar. Now, a little bit about our speaker. Dan Ryan is the Executive Director of the National Conservative Institute of Australia. He is a commercial and technology lawyer with over 20 years of high-level advisory and transactional experience. He has worked as General Counsel for technology companies based across the globe and has particular expertise in China and tech in the Asian region. He speaks Mandarin and is a former board member of the Australia-China Council. Our moderator for today's discussion is Professor James Lawrenson, Director of UTS ACRI. His research interests relate to the Chinese economy and the Australia-China economic and broader relationship. He has previously held appointments at the University of Queensland and Shandong University. His academic research has been published in leading scholarly journals, including China Economic Review, China Economic Journal, and Australian Journal of International Affairs. I will now hand it over to Professor James Lawrenson to begin today's discussion.
Thanks very much, Amy. Look, I'm delighted to be hosting today's webinar. I think the topic and the terrain we're going to be covering today is critically important for Australia. But I've got to admit, in some ways, ACRI is not an obvious host for a good chunk of the terrain that we'll be traversing today. The mission of ACRI, as Amy just said, was to inform Australia's engagement with China. And look, we'll certainly be getting to that. And our guest today certainly has plenty of experience and expertise relating to China. But before moving to that, we'll be spending a fair amount of time talking about the US, Australia's security ally and our most important strategic partner. When I was preparing for today's webinar, it came as somewhat as a surprise, to be honest, just how little attention other US-orientated Australian university research centres and think tanks, think the United States Studies Centre, the Lowy Institute, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and so on, have devoted to today's topic previously. Earlier this month, I published an article in Asia Policy, the Journal of the National Bureau of Asian Research, about Australia's strategic objectives and challenges related to China. One of the points I made is that Australian perceptions of US reliability as a security ally and strategic presence in Asia has long animated Australia's thinking about relations with China. And it seems to me that there's significant political changes afoot in the US that could impact its foreign policy positions. And I'm just not confident that that is being digested in the Australian public right now. Dan, I can see you've got your hand up. Let me just see.
Can you hear me now? Okay, okay, good. Let's try that now.
You can hear me now, Dan?
Unfortunately, yeah. Sorry.
Ah, great.
So I missed the intro in its entirety. But I do. If you just want to repeat anything, and I'll respond to that if you don't mind.
Sure. My apologies for that, Dan. Sorry about that. Okay. Look, let's get this back on track.
Yeah.
So, Dan, I was just overviewing to our audience how I was surprised when preparing for this webinar that other more US orientated think tanks and university researchers in Australia, such as the United States Study Centre, the Lowy Institute, and so on, how little attention they'd devoted to this topic before. And that's surprising because I think Australia's relationship with the United States obviously has critical implications for our relationship with China. And so that's why I'm delighted to be hosting you today. Look, let's quickly get into our discussion. But let me just, before I do that, let me give our audience today one data point by way of introduction. In September, the United States Study Centre hosted the Sydney International Strategy Forum 2025. And when I looked at the speakers, I was struck that it appeared to me to be a cavalcade of never Trump Republicans and Biden administration officials. I'm sure they're nice people, but the point for me is that those people hold no sway in Washington today. And to punctuate that reality, when Kirk Campbell, the US Deputy Secretary of State in the Biden administration, gave an address at the Australian National Press Club in Canberra on the same visit, no one from the US Embassy actually bothered to attend. Pretty striking observation. And with that, let's get to today's discussion. Dan, it's fairly commonplace, I think, in Australian commentary to portray the second Trump administration as quite chaotic, and the president himself as crudely transactional and inclined to make decisions based on the last person that he spoke to. I'm sure you've heard those lines before. But my first question for you, Dan, is that how you see the second Trump presidency, or do you see something far more coherent? Over to you.
Well, just such a facile analysis. I mean, in the 1980s, we talked about Reaganism, right? But it wasn't as though he cooked up the philosophy which guided the presidency at that time himself. There was a coherent philosophy which undergirded it. Similarly, it's quite clear that the Trump administration is guided by an intellectual framework which many people have referred to as national conservatism. It differs from the type of conservatism that's been associated with the Republican Party in recent times, and indeed the centre right in Australia as well, which is why it's confused people on both the political right and left, but it's part of a long-standing, respectable, although somewhat forgotten intellectual tradition. And essentially the three areas where it is different, or it marks a clear departure, are trade, immigration, and foreign policy. On trade, it considers open borders, free trade as essentially utopian. It stresses the need for a policy which ensures that nations have their own industrial base, both for national security reasons, but also for broader economic and social reasons. On foreign policy, it stresses realism. It's hostile to, neoconservatism, the forever wars, the reckless evangelicalism of the George W. Bush era, which wanted to, turn the Middle East into a Smithsonian democracies. It thinks that Americans' interests and the conflicts that it's involved in should only be those where their vital interests are at stake and narrowly defined. And finally, on immigration, it believes that mass immigration poses a serious problem to Western nations. They need to get it under control to ensure it serves the goals of the host nations, but also more fundamentally, that America, or indeed any nation, is not simply an idea, as J.D. Vance said in his acceptance speech for the vice presidency, that there needs to be a focus on recreating a common, united people with a love of a shared past and a common future.
Okay, Dan, so you've just given us the three pillars of national conservative: trade, foreign policy, and immigration. So I guess that leads to my next question. When you look at the second Trump administration, look, any political party leading a country is not necessarily a pure representation of its founding philosophy. I think you could say that about the Australian Labor Party or even the Chinese Communist Party, dare I say. So my second question for you is, when you look at the second Trump administration, how prominently, I guess, do those three pillars feature in that administration? Are there other significant parts of the Trump administration's policy agenda that aren't so neatly wedded to national conservatism?
Oh, I don't know. I think you can definitely recognize those three features as remaining core. Commentators will say things like, "Oh, he abandoned tariffs or adjust them here, there, in particular ways," but there's been no concession that we're returning to the open borders era of George W. Bush circa 2000, right? There's adjustments that need to be made. There are particular cases where you can, there's nuance that is involved, but there's no fundamental change. Similarly, on foreign policy, there can be debates about whether bombing Iran was a good or a bad thing, or America in the Middle East, but they're not advocating for turning these nations into Jeffersonian democracies, right? Like Trump goes to Riyadh, and it's much more of a kind of realist perspective that he brings. Likewise, on immigration, there are big debates within this new spectrum about precisely how it should be done. But you're not at again, it's not the age of George W. Bush or even Reagan, where they talk about, in very gauzy terms, family values don't stop at the Rio Grande, or Jeb Bush talking about immigration being illegal immigration being an act of love. That's dead as the dodo.
Okay, so for you, these are pretty stable and pretty prominent parts of the second Trump administration, the second Trump administration's agenda. So I guess my next question then, Dan, is if we've got the second Trump administration firmly guided by this national conservatist ideology, what comes next? And I guess the background to that is when I listen to commentary from Australia's strategic elite, I think there still remains a fairly high degree of confidence that after Trump, we're going to, quote unquote, go back to normal. Suddenly we'll be talking about allies and partners again in foreign policy. So my question to you, Dan, is what legs do you think national conservatism has apart from Donald Trump, the person? And a different way of putting that would be, say in January 2029, we have an incoming JD Vance Republican administration. In your view, do you think that would look radically different to the second Trump administration, or they would both be guided by those three pillars of national conservatism?
Well, the three pillars have been there since the escalator speech when he came down. I was just reading it the other day. They're all there from the go-get, right? For example, he doesn't talk about climate change or anything in that speech in a way that sometimes the right in Australia assume Trump is more heavily associated with. It's trade, immigration, and foreign policy, and a few little extra things like of that era, like Obamacare, right? But essentially, and if anything, the whole policy framework has become a lot richer and deeper and more coherent. I mean, JD Vance and Marco Rubio famously were very hostile to Trump initially, and now they're some of his most strongest and articulate proponents and defenders, and they are the future of the presumptive future leaders of the Republican Party. So no, it's become more sort of locked in than it was
right.
Even, I think. And there's always kind of nuance to these things. There's conferences that are held. People can argue the merits on different angles. Precisely, how should a more realist trade policy look like with respect to a particular partner? How should adjustments be made? That's all fine, but it doesn't proceed from according to the previous sort of assumptions that existed, that the goal that we all must work towards is an open borders, free trade regime across with every country on the planet, essentially, which is what they dreamed of back in the day.
Yeah, so you mentioned Vance and Rubio. That's interesting. So you're quite convinced that those two voices, Vance and Rubio, they've actually become more strongly convinced by this ideology. So they're just not short-term appeasing Trump and then they're going to change in a few years. You think they're actually on board with this ideology?
I always say read Marco Rubio's, read JD Vance's speeches. He's always hitting the right notes. But Marco Rubio, in his Senate confirmation speech to be Secretary of State, I mean, he just lays it out explicitly, and he talks in a very different way to the way he was when he was a candidate against Trump back in the day. So it's not going away. I think there's a lot of wishful thinking that it would go away, back in 2016 when Trump got elected, and then it would go away again. And we've had now 10 years plus of it. It's time to start engaging with it and recognize this is going to start. I mean, there's been a bipartisan commitment now in the United States for tariffs on China, right? It's not
Indeed
just a Trump thing. That the Democrats have now realized this is politically popular and see the logic of it. They can argue about particular, adjustments here and there.
Yep.
that's not moving anywhere anytime soon, I think.
Yeah, and not only has it been around for 10 years, now we're talking about the next two most obvious leaders of the Republican Party. They're sort of locking in behind it as well. So it doesn't seem to have a neat end date. If anything, it just seems to be growing in prominence. So, Dan, that very nicely leads to my next question. And I think you've sort of touched on this already, but I want to draw you out very explicitly. To what extent do you see Australia, and when I say Australia, to be honest, I mean more the elite. So I mean the Australian government, the opposition, university commentators, think tankers. To what extent do you see them digesting this shift in US politics? I mean, to put my cards on the table, and I kind of did it in the introduction, although I know you couldn't hear that. But one of the things I said was, in my view, Australia doesn't seem to be adjusting or digesting to this new ideology, political ideology in the US very well at all. But that's me. What's your take, Dan?
I just don't think the political us in Australia have wrapped their head around it or properly engaged with national conservatism. I mean, it's starting to bob up as a term which is used more, but they haven't really properly thought through, because at some level I think it's illegitimate or some sort of, I don't know, moral failing or intellectual bogus sort of thing that's being promoted by a con man from New York. I mean, that's the sort of attitude. So when I was in Washington in September for the International NatCon conference, or not only there were senior members of the administration there, like the cabinet level ministers who were walking around and chatting with them, and the rest of it. There were senior staffers. The Australian embassy was 15 minutes walk down the road. I was the only Australian there. No political attaché or anyone else was there. And I was just thinking, sure, this is like, if you want to get, contacts or, understand it and think about how this might impact on Australia, there should have been someone there. And, I watched on the right, the Australian opinion page, I think, and Sky News commentators, I still think, live in the Howard era. They wish that's what they want to go back to, the sort of, they support Trump to the extent he promotes things that like a Jeb Bush would have been in favor of, like cutting taxes and this, that, and the other. But anytime they venture into the true NatCon stuff, they're inherently resistant to it. Andrew Hastie, I think, has a much more of a sense of it. At least he recognizes it's something worth engaging with. He has quite good contacts in the United States, which I think is why he's more tapped into it. On the left, I think there's just this repulsion about Trump, the figure. I accept, he's not to their taste. I fully get it. But again, it just inhibits their intellectual engagement with the underlying policy framework. There are a couple, I mean, the John Curtin Center, Nick Droneforth, had an article the other day which talked about, Andrew Hastie and why he's popular. And he did make mention to things like Blue Labour and the Red Tories, which is a UK national conservative flavour movement that arose a few years back. So those guys get it to a certain extent. But yeah, no, I wait in kind of vain. I think it will hit the Australian shores eventually, but because it's really quite bizarre how blinkered they are and how they simply, it's just not worth discussing or not worth engaging with, or it's an illegitimate tradition. And sorry, guys, you can't wish it away.
Yeah, well, I agree. I mean, that's why I'm very happy to be hosting today's webinar. So, Dan, just to follow up on that, so for you, Andrew Hastie would probably be the Australian fairly senior Australian political figure that you would think is most on the right. Is there like when we talk about the National Party, One Nation, and so on? Do you see any other voices there that you think get it?
Yeah, look, I don't speak for Andrew Hastie, obviously.
Sure.
He has his own views on different things, and they probably differ in many different areas. Look, I think he's obviously the most thoughtful and credible guy who understands that the new right or something needs to happen, change from the Howard era. I mean, he made that famous comment that, the dog-eared textbooks of Hayek. He talked about being a nation that doesn't make flat whites, just flat whites. I mean, that gives a sense that, we need to have it be a nation with a bit more of a substantial industrial base than we do now. So at least in sentiments, he is moving there, and from, again, I'm not putting words in his mouth, but I do, given his experience being a soldier in the Middle East, he shares, I think, the worldview of many of the senior people in the White House who are also Middle East war veterans, like J.D. Vance, Tulsi Gabbard, Jemison Greer, who's the U.S. Trade Representative, Pete Hegseth. I mean, those guys, similar age, similar experience, and also a very similar view with respect to the George W. Bush era. They're actively hostile to it, and that's different to how Howard era ministers talk.
Indeed.
There's quite a big divide there. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Look, Dan, let's start moving to the topic of conversation to China. Now, of course, this is something that you're very comfortable with given your own background, and now you've got the national conservatism element as well. You really are the perfect person to put this question to. My last question was about how you thought Australia is digesting these ideological shifts in the US. So, can I ask you, how do you think China's digesting it? Or maybe to get a bit speculative, do you think people in Beijing and Zhongnanhai will be looking upon this shift in a sort of a positive or a negative light?
I think, I mean, just as a preamble, I always thought that China kind of takes up different waves from the US more than's appreciated. Back in 2000, Thomas Friedman was talking about the China dream in one of his columns, and then Beijing started to talk about the China dream. Then when Trump first got in with his tweets and the rest of it, that sort of spurred a bit of that so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. They were trying to sort of ape what the US was doing. And now, I mean, they in some ways, China was a bit national conservative in its approach to industry policy for a long period of time, but I don't think they find it kind of an illegitimate policy framework. I think they find it very familiar because that's what they have been doing for a period of time. It's the legacy liberal right which finds it so objectionable in some ways. I also think Beijing, again, that they find it all. I think they're actually more comfortable than most people assume with the Trump administration, because the previous, let's call it the George W. Bush right, always sort of harbored dreams of regime change and turning Beijing into a Jeffersonian democracy, whereas that doesn't exist to the same extent with the Trump administration, and I think Beijing kind of knows it, so they kind of. You can reach at least there's a potential to reach a much more, I don't know, enduring modus vivendi between Beijing and Washington, because both recognize they're acting in their national interests, but they both kind of think that's sort of fair play in a way.
Yeah, gosh, talk about irony. I mean, here we are in Australia, a staunch US security ally, but in fact, we may be the ones struggling to accept and recognize this political ideology compared with China. And as you were going through those 3 points, I haven't heard it put like that before, but you're absolutely right. Industrial policy, well, Beijing's pretty comfortable with that. Foreign policy, not being engaged in, regime change and so on. Yep, Beijing tick. Immigration, not, less rather than more, tick. So in fact, clearly, I'm not saying the Chinese Communist Party is national conservatism, but there are elements that they both can recognize as being legitimate.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. I mean, whereas in Australia, J.D. Vance had that famous line that he said, the worst possible foreign policy is for China to make all our stuff and to go to war with China. And in Australia, we have a trade agreement which allows 100% of Chinese manufactured goods to come in duty free. But at the same time, on the right, there's a certain bolshiness which wants to, we're looming up to this sort of great conflict. And that's incoherent. If you're if you really do think that you're gearing up to this great war with China, then you need to change your trade agreement. And if you don't, then you need to have a sort of balance on both fronts. That's where we're still again, still, I keep repeating myself, but we're still operating in that kind of, as though it's 2000.
Yeah, no, that's great, Dan. And that's why I think it's so important that we're having this discussion today. Look, I've got a few more questions for Dan, and I'm going to keep going through those, but I just want to remind our audience today, jump in with your questions. You'll see the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Don't be shy. I think I can speak for Dan and say he's happy to take any questions. So put those in there. But while those questions are rolling in, Dan, now I really want to shift the discussion to the impact of national conservatism on Australia's relationship with China. Now, I thought one way we could do this, if you don't mind, is I might just run through a series of issues and just get your reaction to each of them from a national conservative perspective. Okay, here's the first one. What does national conservatism mean for the future of US support for multilateral institutions like the UN and the World Trade Organization? And just before you answer that, I did note Penny Wong gave a pretty important speech a few days where she again, tripled down on the importance of the multilateral rules-based order for Australia's interests. So where's our US security ally going to head on this?
Well, I think it's like, let's take them each in turn. So the WTO and the, that's obviously going to be far less significant going forward. It might still be useful for parties as a dispute resolution forum that don't involve the US, but it's not going to be anything. It's not going to be relevant for anything US related, really. The UN, I mean, it seems to be a lot less prominent than it once was. I mean, again, it's not going to be something which the US is going to be particularly bound by, nor probably China. Look, I think so many of these things, it depends on the way you view the world, but so many of these organizations were ultimately underwritten by a powerful US. So it's important, from my perspective at least, it's important the US does remain strong because it does underwrite global security. But they're not going to be organizations whose star is rising, put it that way, going forward. Australia can still make those arguments. It's sort of good to mouth the platitudes, I suppose, but just recognize where, real power lies in the global system.
Yeah, and there might be other countries in the region that Australia might be able to build some coalitions around those multilateral institutions, but the US is under the national concern. And to be fair, we should say that all of this is just about national conservatism, right? I mean, the World Trade Organization was defunct from a US perspective during the Biden administration as well. But your view, under national conservatism, that trend will remain very strong.
Yeah, I mean, it's a realist perspective on foreign policy, which is bringing to it. That's sort of, I mean, again, you might wish it otherwise, but you just got to recognize the world as it is, not as you want it to be.
Okay. I think there'll be a lot of sad faces in Canberra right now, but we better face up to the real world. Okay, Dan, here's the second one. And just a reminder, keep those questions coming in. I think this is a big one, Dan. What does national conservatism mean for the US continuing to see the Asia Pacific, as opposed to the Western Hemisphere, as a priority strategic theatre? Is the Asia Pacific going to be a theatre where you think Washington is still going to consider it worthwhile for US blood and treasure to potentially be spilled? Or do you think it'll really home back to the Western Hemisphere?
By Western Hemisphere, do you mean Europe or North and South America?
I mean the US homeland is really what I'm talking about. So the
okay.
West, yeah.
Okay. So look, I mean, the US still remains overly focused, I think, from in Europe and the Middle East, right? There's been a lot of talk since the days of Obama's pivot to Asia about recalibrating. That hasn't happened to the extent Now, I know the National Conservative perspective would wish there's a frustration about being bogged down in Ukraine and other parts of the Middle East. So, look, I think the NACON stuff, again, in foreign policy terms, it's realist. So it recognizes China as a great power, and it thinks that that's where, to the extent that threats exist, that's what it needs to be focused on. But it's not focused on this sort of revolutionary sort of movement to bring democracy to the ends of the earth, which I think was George W. Bush's second inaugural, right? That's not the perspective. So it's a more narrow focus, like I said, on vital interests, narrowly defined. And they recognize China as a certainly great power or potential great power, and are going to be focused on that. So yeah, I think the movement would want a move away from these conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, and much more of a focus on Asia. But it doesn't mean that they're keen in the same way that the previous era Republicans were about toppling Xi Jinping from power or bringing democracy to China in that way. Yeah.
Right. So just to get very specific, so if, for example, and I'm sorry, everyone does this, I know, but so if there was some conflict in the Taiwan Strait, for example, we certainly shouldn't count the US out of that conflict based on national conservatism. So for your view, the realism is still there.
Absolutely.
That could still be seen as a threat to US vital interests from a national conservative perspective.
Yeah, and it would depend on the exact circumstance at the time. But that's like, I think there are different schools of thought about in realism, as you're probably well aware, but there would certainly be a strong perspective that would be a serious, risk to US power, and they consider it on its merits. I mean, I don't think Taiwan should bank on that sort of emotional tie that the US might have had as a sort of defender of democracy. But I still think it's in the US interest to have Taiwan as an ally, and I think that they don't want to reduce their power, so therefore they would support that.
Yeah. So when you were at the NatCon 2025 conference, you mentioned you were there just a couple months ago.
Yeah.
Did you raise these sorts of scenarios with the colleagues that you met over there?
Well, there was a lot of discussion about the Middle East because that was pretty hot at the time, and there was some quite vigorous debates regarding the strike on Iran, right? Because there's different perspectives, both sort of firmly put and reasonably put, but that was the issue of the moment. So, when things hot up, suddenly the cameras go in one direction and no one really talks about the China stuff as much anymore. But I think there were, again, like I said, there would be different realist perspectives on precisely what America's role should be in the event of a conflict in Taiwan, and how it arose would influence the American response. But again, it's not going to be this evangelical, we're doing it because we're in this Cold War with Beijing. I don't think that's the sense they have of the way they view the lay of the land.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Okay. So it's all about power, right? And I guess perhaps that's the difference, because before there would have been that power lens, but there also would have been that ideological lens, as you said, in previous Republican administrations.
Well, I mean, again, there's always caveats to these things.
Yeah, sure.
Well, but because I do think as part of it, there's still a element of the support for the Republicans and Trump in the United States, which is that a older demographic that's still sort of whose heart still sings for that sort of freedom everywhere type of stuff. So there may well be situations where Trump and the administration talks up a particular dissident in China and makes waves, and they would do it in a good-natured sort of way. But it's just a different character to what existed in the 90s. You just have to recognize that. Sometimes people see these little snippets that make them think we've returned to normal programming, and we haven't. Yeah.
Perhaps that's the key lesson we need to get out of today's webinar. Dan, let me just run through two other quick scenarios, and I see we've got some questions coming in now, so keep those coming in, but I do want to make sure I put those questions to you. So just two more from me. How about this scenario? What does national conservatism mean for Washington's commitment to AUKUS as an exercise in, collective deterrence against China becoming more regionally militarily aggressive?
Again, I think they would view it through a much more strict realist lens. So they're not going to, it makes sense for them to have it. It augments their kind of power in the Asia Pacific region. It makes sense for us. And there is support and rhetorical support, and I think genuine support for that in Washington, that arrangement. So also Washington does get a pretty good deal out of AUKUS. I mean, we are paying a lot of money. They are to produce subs. So it's a net, in financial terms, a net win for them, but they are our security guarantor. So we need them as well. So again, I don't know whether, I don't know that there's going to be in practice that much change. It's just worth recognizing the new perspective that is being brought to these issues, because when different circumstances arise, then what kind of reaction
100%.
they will be more receptive to, and ones that they won't be.
Yeah, I've noticed the Australian discussion of AUKUS over the last 6 months. There has been sort of this view that Trump might not be so attached to it. But your message today is that from a realist perspective that is prominent in national conservatism, actually AUKUS aligns pretty well with that.
Well, there was a review, as you know, Alban Colley was reviewing, and he does bring a much more a different perspective to lots of different foreign conflicts that the US has been involved with. Again, he's of that generation that grew up during the forever wars in the Middle East, sort of democracy crusade, so is much more skeptical about the advantages that America getting involved in conflicts here, there, and everywhere brings, and because they don't believe that anymore. And they're probably right. I agree with them that it wasn't productive or popular amongst the public, right, in the US. So it's not going to happen. And but I always think with AUKUS, it's not so much like whether we should have an alliance with the US. You can have reason. It's really a question of like the material, military material involved, and what the deal constitutes. It's not, and you can have reasonable arguments about whether the subs are the best use of the money, and whether we should be better off spending on something else, or whether it can be rejigged in a particular way. It's not a question about whether we should have an alliance with the US. It's the nature and scope of that alliance.
Okay. Final one from me, Dan. Then we're going to Q&A from the audience. Tell me what national conservatism means for US tolerance of Australia relying on and continuing to talk up China as its major trading partner. Is that relevant, or is that something that national conservatism would have a particular view on?
I think that my discussions with, Michael Lind is a name sort of economist who has been for a long time pushing for a more realist trade policy in the US. He thinks it's unsustainable. I think there were statements even during the Obama era that, we had to cut our iron ore exports to China or something. So that's unrealistic. And obviously that would be very detrimental to us. But I would strongly suggest the US, they do need to be informed about, because they don't think about us all that often. To be honest. So they do need to, and yet there's no obvious solution, because the US, we can't simply send our iron ore across the Pacific and through the Panama Canal up the Mississippi to be turned into steel in the industrial Midwest. The economics of it doesn't quite work, but it is a historically unprecedented situation for a nation to have such a strong reliance on one country for its economic needs, China, and then another rely wholeheartedly on another great power for its strategic needs. I can't readily think. I put this to lots of different people, Andrew Hastie and others, and no one can quite think of one which works the same way. Some of the East Asian countries, arguably, but they're a different kettle of fish as well. So, it's worked for a while, but there does need to be, I think, a rejigging of our
Yep,
arrangements
sure.
so that the US, as it rebuilds its industrial base, that we are the raw material and other supply, but also that we rebuild our industrial base. Because as we discussed offline, we are, even by our peer standards, incredibly deindustrialized. I mean, we have like less than 5% and arguably going down to 3% with our smelters, hanging on by a thread. Nations, this is a big NatCon theme, and nations need to be able to produce things that they can't. They're not just an economic zone. They have industrial interests and interests that aren't simply that go beyond simply lovely liberal maxims about that in an ideal world it would be less economically efficient to do that way. Well, we don't live in an ideal world, or we never.
Sure.
Yep.
Yeah, so national conservatism would be skeptical of the position Australia is in. I guess but does that mean that they would put active pressure on Australia to curtail that relationship, or would they just think we're stupid and silly for getting ourselves in that position?
Well, if Australia was to make some sort of dramatic decision and say, we don't care about critical minerals, we're just going to keep selling them to China completely, then I think that would create some bad blood in the US.
Yes.
If they were, and I think there at least needs to be a plan for a rejigging. Because, if you're sending all your iron ore to China and if there was a conflict, ultimately, Robert Menzies still copped flack for selling pig iron to sort of Japan back in the day, right? How would it be viewed from Ohio if Australia was responsible and had been responsible in the lead up to a great conflict in sending the key components, raw materials that China was relying on to support that conflict? Just that's how it would look. So this needs to be a rejigging. It can be done. It can be done. It needs to be done thoughtfully in a mature way. I think you need to go into. I think we need to rejig our arrangements with China. We do need to, but it doesn't need to be done in a hostile way, like with Churchillian statements and the rest of it. It just needs to be done in a kind of, adult way, if that's done, because it's not great for us, and it doesn't make sense in the new scheme of things.
Yep. Okay, Dan, we've got a bunch of questions from the audience, so let me put these to you. If you can try and keep your answers as brief as you can, because there are a lot of, I do want to make sure we get through them all. So the first question is, what do you mean? I think the person is talking to you, but he could also be talking to me. What do you mean when you say China and the US recognize each other's policy as legitimate?
Well, Beijing has been practicing an industrial policy, whereas in the past sort of 30 years, industrial policy has been and has been seen as out of date in the US. So I think Beijing sees that and goes, okay, they're doing it. Probably it would have been beneficial for us if they didn't, but they are, and it's not like something completely out of the park that we have never heard of before. So
right.
That's kind of what I mean. The Washington taking a 10% stake in Intel. The Chinese government also takes stakes in its company. So that's the type of thing that they would, I think, recognize.
Yep. Okay, got it. All right, next question. This is a good one. This actually, maybe you might want to spend a couple minutes on this. What kind of Australian defence policy best suits a national conservative lens? So if Australia was to head down this route, and actually I do have a question, I'm not sure if I'll get to it, but that was sort of something I wanted to ask about as well. So let me put that question to you in that form. What Australian defence policy do you think would best suit a national conservative lens if Australia goes down that route?
Well, I mean, it's sort of a very, very big question, but it has to be one where we have an industrial base to support our defence industries, because a national conservative perspective or a realist perspective would say it's crazy to be completely reliant on a defence partner, even one that you've had a long-standing relationship with, like the United States, because you never know. They act in their interest. We're an independent state. We act in ours. So, and you won't get an industrial base rebuilt in Australia as long as you continue with the trade policies that were put in place in the 1990s. So yeah, I think we are going to have to sort of be a little bit more clear-eyed and cold-eyed and bit mean about the true state of the world out there.
Yeah.
But it's in our interest to keep the relationship with the United States from a strategic perspective really strong. So we'll give a lot and take a lot to ensure that continues. And that's a sort of very short answer to, I think, a very broad question.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, so that if I could try and summarize, so self-reliance would definitely take on that'd be a real core part of a national conservative perspective. Although, of course, we would maintain ties with the US.
That's right. Yeah, you would have to be more self-reliant and more acting in your own interests while maintaining your, the relationship with your, great and powerful friend.
Yeah. Okay. Next question, Dan. It's kind of an expansion on one I asked. So, how might the worldview of national conservatism alter American expectations of Australia? So, I sort of put a particular one to you before in terms of Australia's trade relationship with China. But when you think about this, are there particular parts of Australian foreign policy or industrial policy that you think are particularly ripe for Washington that's influenced by national conservatism to start putting the finger on Australia a bit?
I mean, there will be different political constituencies in the United States that will commercial constituencies that probably won't like the fact that we're, in many cases, an open market for Chinese manufactured goods that the US also wants to produce. Like, for example, I think read a stat the other day saying that China sells more electric vehicles in Australia than it does in the whole of the United States. So if they're trying to build up that area, then there will be, I imagine, commercial interests there that will say, hey, you're our ally. We should get closer together, and you should be buying more American EVs. And that's one example. Or American-made drones. Why are you using Chinese drones? Or American-made CCTV cameras and other technologically advanced manufactured product. I think there will be a tendency towards that. I mean, the way this plays, and this is what people like Michael Lynn have said, is that we are going to be moving in a direction where we do have to more closely integrate with the United States, because at the moment we're kind of out of sync. Now that that can be done well or done poorly, but that's the direction of travel.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a great soundbite, I think, for this webinar. That's a fantastic summary. Next question, Dan, and this is a good one. This is getting away a bit from national conservatism, but I think you'll still be well placed to answer it. The question is, do you see this new realism lens? So we've talked a lot about realism being a prominent feature of national conservatism, but do you see that new realism lens for geopolitics on the up and up amongst the Democratic Party, maybe particularly young people? Or what do you see on the other side of US politics on that particular strand?
It's just funny. Like, I think that, again, polls bounce around all the time. I think there is a constituency in the Democratic Party which was certainly anti for a long period of time interventions in the Middle East, right? There were protests led by Barack Obama. One of the things that distinguished him from Hillary Clinton was he said the Iraq War was terrible. And I think sometimes when their party gets into power, then they're obliged to then support the policies that are in place. But, I can see the young turning against the Ukraine conflict in due course, potentially, the young Democrats. I mean, I can certainly see that happening. You got to remember, the crazy, like Bernie Sanders, the socialist candidate, he's rejoined the Democratic Party. I mean, he was against free trade. He was against actually open borders, mass immigration as well. He was against the forever wars. So in some ways, there was even though they come from very different, he would not associate himself with Trump at all. But there actually is far less divide than you think between those guys and the kind of the legacy left and right on both the Democratic and the Republican side.
Yeah. That's a good point. Dan, here's another one. I want to get this in because it puts into a third country perspective in. So the question is a very specific one, but maybe you can sort of reflect on the concept more generally. It says, in the context of what you've said about Trump's foreign policy, do you think he will support Japan in the current spat between China and Japan over the Japanese PM's remarks about Taiwan? So I guess the question is the US likely to lob into a dispute between third countries under national conservatism?
Yeah, again, we do use the label national conservatism, and I would just say like foreign policy realism is an
Yeah,
element of it.
okay.
So it's worth just analyzing it purely in realist terms. And again, it depends on the skill. But the relationship between Japan and the United States is very, very strong. And the personal relationship and the new prime minister there, and actually with the former prime minister, Trump was very close with as well. I think they kind of recognize each other as kindred spirits. I mean, Japan also has a somewhat of a kind of Nat Connie perspective when it comes to industrial policy and other things as well. And yet it's democratic, so it has the additional sort of
Yes.
It's a much more closer aligned in that sense. So yeah, look, and they're doing all the right things, I think. Japan in recalibrating, and but as to whether part of why I think the Trump presidency is often characterized as chaotic, like I think you said at the outset, is that he does like to sort of keep the options open to strike a potentially innovative deal at the time, depending. And in fact, if you read him closely, he often says one of his criticisms of previous administrations is they telegraph too much their intentions in advance, either with respect to trade deals or military conflict. And what we often see is Trump making kind of like statements on both sides of the line, and then all of a sudden, surprise, surprise, there's this quite comprehensive and reasonably thought out sort of text and deal which comes to the fore. That pattern seems to be repeated again and again. And I just think people need to like recognize the trick that's going on there.
Yeah.
The chaos is in some ways a strategic tactic.
Yeah. Sure.
So as to what will happen precisely with respect to Japan and I mean Taiwan, it all just depends precisely on the circumstances. But it's I'm just surprised how closely aligned in many ways the Japanese and the Americans are today.
Okay. Dan, this is one more question from the audience. We might just have time for one more, but this is a big one again. This is something I was going to ask you. The question is very simple. Could Australia become a national conservative country, and what would it look like? So how much legs do you think this ideology has in Australia?
Well, it's not just a US in the Anglosphere. As viewers are well aware, the Reform Party is well ahead of the polls in the UK, and the existing legacy Tory party is down, as is Labour. Now, Nigel Farage's senior advisor now is a guy called Dr. James Orr, who leads the National Conservatives in Europe. So it's going to be the governing ideology if reform takeover in London as well. I mean, although Farage has a bit more sort of Thatcherite tendencies, but he wouldn't employ someone if he didn't recognise that this was a sort of wave of the future. So I just think it defies belief to think that you can have a NatCon presidency in Washington, on PM in London, and Australia sticking to kind of Hawke Howard era sort of trade foreign policy sort of framework here. It just has to change. But precisely how that occurs, like I mean, Hastie has more of a sense of it than most. But and I certainly don't speak for him. But I just that's like hopefully, from my perspective at least, the penny will drop across the scene in a bipartisan way, and people will start to think anew about how things need to change here, because it's just not, you can't wish it away. It's not going away.
Yeah, it would be quite extraordinary. I mean, thinking of the AUKUS partnership, if we have a national conservative bent in Washington and London, and we're sort of like a shag on a rock in a completely different place, that would, well, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it would be a pretty bizarre situation.
Things will go on, but it will just be like, it will just be, as we have continued to be sort of misinterpreting why things are
Got
occurring
it.
and not being able to appropriately respond in, I think, the way we should.
Yeah. Well, Dan, that's exactly why I'm delighted we have you today. And Dan, I've got one final question to round things out, but I did just want to make sure to apologise for the technical difficulties
That's right. No
we
problem.
had at the start of the call. I think certainly the guts of the conversation has been recorded, and I think our audience will appreciate it. So let me finish with this before throwing back to Amy. Where can we find out more information about your work and that of the National Conservative Institute of Australia? Because I think there'll be a lot of interest, particularly in the coming months.
Sure. So the site in Australia is nationalconservatism.org.au. The site of the organization in the US is nationalconservatism.org. And I always point people to the works of Yoram Hazony, who wrote a book called The Virtue of Nationalism, as well as another book called Conservatism Rediscovered. I mean, they're good standard texts to jump into, but there's people like Patrick Deneen who have been critical of liberalism, and certainly, I mean, they certainly understand this. They spoke at the conference, and there's many others. I mean, listen closely to J.D. Vance, and you'll pick up. It will all start to make sense, I think, if you approach it from a kind of from an ACCON lens. So that there's plenty of podcasts on that website that we have in Australia that from guests both here and abroad. There's plenty of articles, and I think it's not that hard to get. Once you wrap your head around it, I think people will start to see how it makes sense. But we certainly need to move on from this idea that it's madman in the White House, transactional, erratic. I mean, that's such a poor way of understanding what's going on.
Well, thanks very much, Dan. Amy, I'm just now going to throw back to you, but I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I'm glad that the Australia-China Relations Institute has been able to raise a bit of awareness about this because I think it's critical, not just for Australia-US relations, but Australia's relationship with China too.
And can I just say thanks, James? We come from things from slightly different perspectives, but I appreciate your inviting me on and our discussions, and I think both of us learn things from doing so. Yep.
100%. Okay, back to you, Amy.
Thank you to Mr. Dan Ryan and Professor James Lawrenson for today's discussion. Members of the audience will be sending an email to everyone here asking for your thoughts on how this webinar went. If you could please fill out that feedback form, we'd really appreciate it so that we can make future events a better experience for everyone involved. If you wanted to know more about the Australia-China relationship and about UTS ACRI's research, more details are available on uts.edu.au/ACRI. The discussion today will also be made available there soon. Please follow at ACRI_UTS on X for the latest news. Thanks again to our speakers and to all our attendees. See you next time.